Yes. Dun, 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 ba-bum. Oh, okay. Are we? All right. Good. Looks good. Looks good. All right. Okay. All right. Oh, Facebook. You are so little fun. Come on. All right. Good evening, lazies and gingerbreads. Welcome aboard. I'm Tad. I am the conductor of this particular train, and where it's going, nobody knows. Not even me, not even Willy Wonka. But I am going to be here for the next hour, and I am going to be reading. So that's how it works. So let me quickly say hello to the friends who have lined up here to say hello, and then I will quickly tell you what's going on at our house, although none of it's very interesting or significant. But hello, Ilva. Good morning. Wouter, good morning. Ronnie, guten Morgen. Goody Morgan, as you wrote. Leah. Can't remember. Oh, happy middle of the night to you, too. Chris, hello, good morning. And Holger, good to see you. Carol, a pleasure. Dirk, yes, nice to see you too. Felina, good morning, happy springtime. Yes, we've been having a nice spring so far, just in the fact of it being all springy in the way that it is. We were out looking at the lilac tree today. Mihai, hello, lovely to see you. Petra, hello, both Spirer girls. Or Spirer. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but you know I'm talking to you. So good to see you. And I'm glad to hear Christina's visiting you. I hope you're having a good time. Julian, good to see you. Jessica, hello. Seb, good to see you. And Mark, good morning. And who else is here? Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. Hi, Cliff. Hi, John. Okay, I think I got everybody here. At least everybody who's signed in so far. So, what's going on here? Not a huge Leah. Thank you, Leah. Anyway, it always just helps me to know, even if I forget it within 6 minutes, because I have the attention span of a goldfish in a very small bowl. But that's okay. Anyway, so yeah, things are pretty normal here. It's spring has been sprung, and the weather's been nice the last few days. Big household news number one. One of our people, our most needy, got her first vaccination, which is excellent. And oh, Alex, hi Alex. So that's our daughter who has the pulmonary issues. And so we are very pleased that she's got her first shot. The rest of us haven't yet, but you know, it'll happen. The other good thing was that after trying to find someone who could do it for us, I finally gave up on it and went out and spent a few days and fixed the fence myself. And so Johnny the dog can now go in and out freely and run around in his capacious back garden, barking at passersby, warning us about trucks, all the things that he's supposed to do as far as he's concerned. And this is a good thing. So he's a much calmer, happier dog at the moment. And actually, it was quite heart melting the first time I was able to take him out with me and say, no, look, you can go out without the leash back in your yard again. And he was so thrilled. He just ran, he ran back and forth. He leaped up and down. He just did every dog thing to say, I am really happy to be back in the yard and not on a leash anymore. So that was a good thing. And as I mentioned, the lilac tree is in absolutely almost psychopathic blossom. It's just going. So we were out today looking at that and the myriad of bugs that were hanging around with it, including fake bees and honeybees and bumblebees. Because of where we live, which has a very peculiar little microclimate of its own, we have decided a long time ago that we have a lot of part of our property is wild, but around our house we have plantings, mostly Deb's work, and a lot of work it has been as well. And they are native. So, and one of the reasons that we wanted to plant native shots. Oh, hello, Hazel. My mother-in-law has checked in to say had her second shot last Wednesday. Yay! Excellent. Very glad to hear it, Hazel. That is good news. Andreas and Ava, lovely to see you both. So anyway, we were out checking that out, and that was really cool. And we have a lot of native plants planted, or only native plants planted, in large part because of bees. There are actually native California bees that have been declining rapidly, not just like the honeybees all crashing at once, but just because they're native bees, and a lot of the bees that get brought in for massive agricultural things and stuff like that are not native. They are, like a lot of things, they have been bred. So the native bees get pushed out. So we've been planting a lot of native plants so that the bees, the local bees can have can feel comfortable, I guess, basically. So we've been back out in the yard again, which is really nice. We have returned to the occasional evening visit to the gazebo now that it's not quite so cold, which is, when you got 6 people and several animals living in a house, it's nice sometimes to get outside of the house for a while. And Deb and I tend to evacuate ourselves to the gazebo some evenings just to have some quiet time. Sometimes we listen to music out there. It's quite nice. Anyway, so that's what's going on here. It's still hanging in, doing what we need to do, talking about various things. I've actually spent most of the last week, instead of working on the Navigator's Children, I'm working on a proposal for, among other things, the possibility of a Flan's Crow book. Flan's Crows, because they are a group. So I'm working on that. And most of that has been thinking, which is always the most fun part for me, because I can do it horizontally, which is my best position. And I rather enjoy just being able to think and throw things around and say, that's not going to work, but that might. And let's hook that up to that and see what happens there. And what if we do this? And I don't know, that character doesn't really quite work. What if we make she into a he, or him into an it, or, and just mess around with things. And I always use my hands like this too. This is super important. No, it's not. Once I start talking, considering how extremely waspy my family is. Well, not waspy, because wasp means white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And we're actually white Anglo-Saxon and Celtic and not Protestant. So, but you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, considering what a waspy family in a lot of ways that I come from, we're remarkably Mediterranean when it comes to the use of hands, and also highly active conversation. So I'm sure you figured that out, those of you who've ever seen me in public. As soon as I start talking, I start flinging my hands around and start doing odd voices and stuff. So This is probably no shock to any of you. Okay, so that's basically what's going on. I'm very pleased. My daughter has gotten her first shot. My mother-in-law just said she had her second shot. It's all good. And so I'm going to read. So for those of you who do not remember, and you'll have to bear with me a little bit because when I have this thing open, I can't actually see the camera very well, which has gone out of focus again. There we go. Let it come back in. So last week, I started reading The Scissor Hour. The basic premise of The Scissor Hour, for those of you who missed the first part of it, is a girl named Catkin Winterberry, who is not actually a girl in the sense that we would think of it, but she is a fairy. She is a young female fairy. Young in this case being pre-adolescent, which in her case means about 67 years old. And bored, an only child, 2 working parents, a superstitious great-grandmother. And her superstitious great-grandmother tells her about a story about an old-fashioned clock that she has, and that there's such a thing as the scissor hour that happens when the little hand moves up and snips at midnight. Sorry, the big hand moves up and snips in time with the small hand at midnight, and that things happen then. Well, it happens that she accidentally, while chasing a little tiny night sprite, or whatever they're called, it's my book, but I can't remember. She accidentally turns with her shins 3 times trying to catch this little tiny unspeaking sprite, and falls through into what the readers recognize fairly quickly as our world. From the fairy world to our world, she discovers that she has apparently been summoned by a boy who has a particular syndrome. He's in a hospital. He has what's called stiff skin syndrome, which is a real thing, quite awful, where his outer body is getting progressively stiffer and stiffer, and eventually it will kill him. But before that, it will make him essentially completely unable to move. So, and she meets this boy, Ezra, and who is apparently without parents. He's lost his parents somehow. And it turns out that Ezra had wished that the Tooth Fairy would come and grant him a wish, which is to get him out of the hospital. And Kat has to tell him that she is not, in fact, a Tooth Fairy, and neither is the little tiny sprite that has come with her, whose nearly unpronounceable name they have shortened to Pift, P-I-F-F-T, and a lot of plosives there. And anyway, so, and then Maribela, the nurse, comes in, and she is quite shocked to find somebody in Ezra's room in the middle of the night in the hospital. But as she becomes more used to the idea of these 2 strange creatures, one which looks like a normal human, but the other one is, you know, the size of a bumblebee, and it can talk. While this is all happening, she says, well, there's, Kat has had an idea, because she can't get back to Fairyland. She doesn't know how she got here to this place in the first place. And so the nurse, Kat says to the nurse, you know, well, I need to go to a shrine of, oh God, what is it called? A particular kind of shrine. Oh, I've forgotten now. And Spirit of the Crossroads. She needs to find a shrine to the Spirit of the Crossroads, who is traditionally shown with 2 faces. And the nurse actually says, you know, oh, that's so funny. You know, Mr. D, you know, that's like Mr. D, Delvin, this person who works at the hospital, and nobody except Mary Alba, the nurse, has any idea what she means by that. Anyway, the nurse has to go off and finish her rounds, and she's going to come back and get Kat out of the hospital because Ezra needs his rest because he's a very, very sick boy. Anyway, so that's kind of where we are. And so she's just gone out, and that's where we were. And I'm going to go back and read the last page or so before we go on with the story, also because it's taken me a long time, so I better jump on it. A long time to explain. Anyway, so Kat says, oh, for the hallowed grove's sake, don't be ridiculous. She turned to Ezra. Marielba, the nurse, she said something about someone named Mr. D? I know him, the boy said quickly. I can take you to him. Take me to him? Kat frowned in disbelief, then did her best to make her face neutral. I thought you couldn't get around, that you were stuck in bed. Well, duh, you never heard of wheelchairs? You can push me. I don't think that sounds like a good idea, she said. I don't even belong here, remember? What if I get you into trouble? Trouble? Ezra could not sit up, but he squirmed enough to make it clear that he wanted to. Trouble? I'm dying. I'll probably die in this room, so what kind of trouble can they throw at me? His eyes had grown red around the edges. Besides, you couldn't find Mr. D without me. I know where he is, Kat. That's your name, right, Kat? Without me, you'll just get lost and wander around. You could give me directions. Too complicated. He shook his head, though it was not easy for him, and he grimaced in pain. No, you have to take me. Remember, I'm the reason you came here. Because you thought I was the, what did you call it? A tooth fairy? Still, come on, you know you need me. How long can you wander around this big old hospital with your little friend, even at night, before someone notices? He seemed to gain strength with each new argument. You need me. She wanted to say she didn't need anyone, but that was obviously not true. She stared at his flushed, determined face. The boy was right, of course. It wasn't like he had a lot to lose. Well, let's go then. Yes! Ezra pumped his fist as best he could. Let's find some wheels and get this show on the road. I don't feel good about this, Kat said, rolling the wheelchair into place beside Ezra's bed. Don't worry, Mrs. Blanketsop isn't going to miss it. I told you she never uses it. He smiled. Fights with the nurses when they try to put her in it. Calls them spies and murderers. Are they? Ezra laughed. The nurses? Nah, most of them are pretty nice, really. Especially Marialba. She always brings me things she baked at home, and she doesn't pretend like I'm going to get better any day now, like most of the people around here do. His face turned somber. I'm not, you know, going to get better. I'm sorry, Ezra. I wish I could do something to help. He showed her a crooked grin. Hey, you showed up and made things interesting. That's pretty good, even if I didn't get my wish. I'm hanging with a real live fairy. Two, said Pift in an indignant squeak. Two fairies. It was even harder than Kat had suspected to get someone who couldn't bend at the waist into a wheelchair, especially with Pift buzzing in anxious circles around her head, making unwanted suggestions. At last, by dragging Ezra off the bed onto several pillows stacked on the chair for support, then lifting and extending the chair's footrests as far as they would go, she finally maneuvered him into a supine position, not unlike a chest of drawers being transported on a wheelbarrow. Where do we go? She asked after she had caught her breath. Outside. But we have to wait until the people on the front desk are gone. He frowned, thinking. Maybe we could pull a fire alarm. Kat knew fire alarms from Fairy. Some things seemed to be the same in both worlds. This place is full of sick people, hurt people, right? That doesn't sound like a good idea. And what did you mean outside? Outside. Ezra's expression became guarded. But I can't just tell you. I have to show you. Like I said, though, there's a nurse and a guard out at the main desk in the lobby. We'll have to wait until they're not looking or something. No way they'll let you take me out in the middle of the night. Kat thought for a moment. Pift, I think we have a job for you. What if they swat me? Asked the fairy, sitting on her fingertip. Kat could make out his impossibly small face just well enough to see how anxious he was. Don't get that close to them.
In fact, if you let them see that you're not just a bug, well, that might be a problem. That means you can't talk either. Just, I don't know, make some weird buzzing sound.
Wow, that is an ugly thing to ask.
The night sprite said, shaking his tiny head.
I'm a person, you know, just like you.
Not exactly. If you were just like me, you'd only be a crazy person dancing around the lobby, and they wouldn't let you get away. But if you don't want to buzz, don't buzz. Nobody's trying to oppress you. It was hard to watch Pift's performance because Kat had to keep looking in different directions while waiting for her moment, but he seemed to do a good job. Within moments of his arrival, the security guard was swatting wildly at the air, and the nurse had gone to get a broom. When the guard chased Pift around a corner of the lobby and out of sight, she made her move. As she pushed Ezra rapidly across the open, tiled space, the door swept open, even though no one was nearby. Kat was impressed by this world's magic despite herself. She pushed the chair through, then, just as the doors began to hum closed behind her, a small shape came hurtling after them.
Wow,
said Pift.
Did you see me working? Those people were totally pixelated. I mean, that was old school.
Where do I go, Ezra? Kat asked, but the boy did not reply immediately. She looked down, half afraid he had passed out from the excitement, but he was staring up past the mysterious orange glow of the parking lot toward the sky. Ezra? Are you sick? Just looking at the stars, he said in a hushed voice. I haven't seen them for a while. Longer than I realized. That's great, but tell me where to go. He lowered his gaze, then pointed toward a blocky shape with lit windows at the far end of the parking lot from the main doors. There, that little square building. That's where Mr. D works. Kat stared at it, then at Ezra, then back at the tiny house near the entrance from the main road. That's it? That's the place you couldn't describe to me? It's the only building in the parking lot. His look was defiant. Well, it was the only way I was going to get outside. I don't want to die without ever going outside again. Did you lie about him knowing you, this Mr. D, and being your friend too? She was beginning to feel a little panicky. No. I mean, we're not best friends or anything, but he knows me. The last time they brought me in, he said, "Hey, Ezra, good to see you again," and he gave me a Jolly Rancher. Great. Whatever that means. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. The security guard and nurse were coming back into the lobby, arguing about their lost quarry, who was currently hovering over Kat's head. She quickly pushed the wheelchair to one side of the door and out of view from the lobby, then bumped it down the curb. She started pushing the chair on a long, roundabout curve through the parking lot that seemed as if it would keep them out of easy sight from the front desk. The little cabin had windows on all sides and glowed like a lantern among the lesser orange lights on poles. Distracted by Pift diving suddenly past her face, she bumped into a parked car's bumpers with the footplates of the wheelchair, and a brief noise of pain by Ezra was followed within a second by a horribly loud hooting sound that scared Kat so badly she almost let go of the wheelchair and ran away. But Ezra grabbed her hand. It's just an alarm. You bumped it. It'll turn off in a minute. But the sounds seemed to follow them much longer than that as Kat hurried the wheelchair across the open spaces of the parking lot. As they put the first row of parked cars between themselves and the glassed-in lobby, the horrible mechanical bleating finally went silent. Stop worrying, whispered Ezra, though he sounded a bit nervous himself. Those alarms go off all night. I should know. Mary Alba said a cat jumping on the hood can set them off. Even the guards usually ignore them. Kat shook her head. They hurried between rows of parked cars, weird box-like vehicles with thick blobby wheels, row upon row, sitting silent as dead things. The sky was full of stars, but they seemed faint and far away. The cars, the stars, and the featureless cuboid buildings that surrounded them all looked so alien that she was suddenly pierced by a terrible homesickness. Even the lights on poles on the road beyond the parking lot flickered from green to yellow to red so abruptly that it seemed as though the whole world had shifted in an instant. What if I never see my mother and father again? Or great-grand? Who'll feed calculus and make sure to scratch him on that spot right in front of his ears? She didn't think she could stay alive long in a place of such grim, dreadful magic. It was all she could do as they approached the little building to breathe in and breathe out and keep her legs moving. The cottage was the brightest thing in the parking lot, but the only shape she could see inside it was the silhouette of a round, shaved head on top of a wide neck and extremely bulky shoulders. Whoever it was seemed only a few steps down in size from the ogres back home. Oh, I wish it were Boulder or some other ogre waiting there. Or even that it was a bridge and that was a troll waiting to riddle at me and maybe eat me. Anything normal. Even Ezra had fallen silent, as though the bravado he had used to convince her to smuggle him out had deserted him. Then something tall suddenly came into view across the street from the parking lot. A knife-like spire, black as ebony, black as tar, black as if it swallowed light. Cat stopped, heart skipping in fear. What is that? Her voice was a ragged whisper. The building loomed just across the wide street, like a waiting assassin. Its tower stretched toward the dim stars like the spiny, venomous tail of a basilisk. Mary Albert told you already. Ezra sounded short of breath and more than a little nervous. That's St. Cristobal's, the church. What's the big deal? It's wrong. It makes my skin crawl. Cat struggled for words. It's like looking down a Nixie maelstrom to the bottom of the sea where the light doesn't go. Whatever that means. He tugged on her arm. Look, over in the guard booth. Mr. D's there. She was reluctant to take her eyes off the darkly looming church, as if it were the shadow of a lurking predator. Mr. D, the one you need to talk to? He's on duty. That's good. She finally turned her back. They were only a dozen yards away from the guard shack now, and she could finally make out its inhabitant. She saw at once that something was very wrong with him, and once more her heart stuttered, as if tangled in her ribs like a trapped bird. What happened to his face? It was one of the strangest faces Cat had ever seen, and even for a denizen of the more homogeneous suburbs of a fairy, that was saying something. It seemed malformed, although it was hard to say exactly why. Its dimensions oddly flat, the shadows caused by its prominences all out of proportion in some way Cat could not immediately grasp, and as lifeless as the gray face of a hollow man. We're going to ask that for help? She thought. Her feet slowed, though she was only peripherally aware of it, and she was a terrified moment from turning and running back to the at least slightly familiar brightness of the hospital when Ezra called out, Mr. D! Mr. D! The bizarre, fixed, dead face turned out of view, and another appeared, this one just as dark of skin but with a lively expression of surprise. Who's there? It said, the mouth moving in unison with the words, just like a mouth was supposed to move. The bulky figure rose and came out of the door of the booth, a tall, hugely muscled, dark-skinned man with a badge on his chest. As he stood looking down at the two of them, his expression changed from astonishment to something like amusement, tempered with concern. What the hell? Said Mr. D. Is that you, Ezra? What in the name of God are you doing out here? And who's that? The G word made Kat's stomach flop. Her mouth filled with sour saliva so that Ezra had to answer for her. This is Kat, Mr. D. She's a fairy. Not the tooth fairy, though. I got that wrong.
I honestly don't know what the hell you're talking about, boy, but you sure shouldn't be out here in the cold. And your friend here is too young to be a nurse, so I'm calling someone to come get you. Bring that chair over by the door where you'll get some heat.
He turned back toward the booth, and in that instant, Kat realized that the face on the back of his shiny, shaved head was a tattoo, not a real face at all. The man with two faces, she thought, relief and worry mixed. Just ink. Could he still be the spirit of the crossroads? Don't call anyone, said Ezra loudly, then lowered his voice. Please, Mr. D, don't do that. Let me stay out a little longer with my friend. I never get outside anymore. They'll just put me back in bed. He paused, then looked the guard in the eye, defiant. And we all know I'm going to die in that bed. The big, bald man stopped in the doorway of the booth.
I can't do it, Ezra.
Can't do it, little dude. I got a call. He was interrupted mid-sentence by a single rolling note, deep and round, far louder than when they had last heard it inside. It struck Kat like a blow in the stomach, doubling her over, filling her with dull, aching nausea.
What's wrong with her?
Asked the guard in alarm. The bell, she grunted after a moment.
It hurts.
I told you, said Ezra, she's a fairy. I don't think they like bells.
Churches,
she said, again swallowing bile, for she had realized what it was that was affecting her. Remembered great-grand's tales of such houses of horror, places no fairy could tread and stay sane.
It's that church. It hurts me. At least the bell does.
You won't believe me, Mr. D, said Ezra. I know you won't, but Kat's a real fairy.
She's got some kind of condition, boy. We need to get her back inside, too.
No, Kat straightened up. I have to find my way home. I have to get back to Fairy.
No, I have to call,
Mr. D began. Then all of a sudden, a tiny buzzing shadow dropped down out of the darkness to land on the sill of the window beside him.
She's telling the truth,
said Pift, his voice full of shrill indignation.
She needs your help.
Mr. D's eyes bulged. What in God's name? Stop saying that.
Kat fought for breath.
That's Pift.
He's a fairy, too. And you're the one with two faces. The spirit of the crossroads. You're the only one who can help me get back to my world. The guard looked at her, then at Pift standing on the windowsill, tiny fists on minuscule hips in a pose of brave resistance. He could not take his eyes off the night sprite, and even passed one of his hands slowly before him, as if to see whether the little apparition would still be there after he had waved it away. It was.
Man,
the guard said at last, his voice low and shaky.
What is going on here?
Kat straightened up. My great-grandmother said if I ever got lost, I had to find the spirit of the crossroads, who had two faces, and the spirit would help me get home. She quickly told Mr. D her story, with wild and largely inaccurate additions from Ezra, and high-pitched, self-interested corrections from the night sprite. The big man sat listening with a sagging jaw, but every time he seemed about to protest in disbelief, his attention swung to the tiny figure of Pift bumping gently against the light in the booth's ceiling, and he remained silent.
But I'm not none of those things you say. Spirit of the crossroad, he said when she had finished. My daddy was a doorman at the Elysium Apartments. My grandpappy worked the ferry boats. The only thing I know is that this boy here should be in a hospital bed, not shivering in a parking lot at almost midnight.
That gave Kat a moment's pause, since she knew she had crossed over from her own world at midnight. It must be more like 1 in the morning now, she knew, but she pushed the distraction out of her thoughts. "You have to know something, Mr. D," she said, even if you don't know you know." He gave her a look full of pain and confusion.
"How can I know something I don't know, child? Because I got a foolish tattoo on my head when I was young and getting into trouble?"
Despite her fear and desperation, Kat liked the big man. Every time he looked at Ezra, his eyes got misty, and he rubbed his big hands together over and over, clearly torn between the evidence of his eyes and his fears for the boy's safety. "So you're really saying you don't know anything about crossing from one world into the next? But my great-grand is always right about things like that."
"Crossing from one world to another?" The guard sighed. "I'm not the space program, girl."
Then his eyes narrowed in memory.
"I had a spooky grandma of my own, see, so I know about those kind of stories. But that doesn't mean they're true. Old ones are always talking about the old ways. My yaya is always going on about ghosts and devils, how to keep off curses, and why you don't spin widdershins lest the devil might take you."
A tiny ember of hope flared inside her.
"Spinning withershins! That's how I got here."
"But how can someone get back? Spinning sunwise? Does it have to be at midnight like my great-grand said?" If so, she realized, with a clutch of fear, it was already too late tonight to do anything. She'd have to spend at least another day in this place, and Kat had learned in natural philosophy class that time moved differently between fairy and other worlds. It might be years before she got back. Or never, she thought, and the reality of what had happened began to pull her down into hopelessness.
"Spinning sunrise? What's that mean?"
Mr. D shook his heavy head.
"No, I never heard nothing about that. But—"
He trailed off, his eyes suddenly far away.
"Hold on. My yaya used to say something. She told a story when I was a little one."
Hey, someone just came out of the hospital,"
squealed Piff from his high perch.
"He's looking around."
"It's the night guard," said Ezra. "What's his name? Charles." "Oh, that ain't good," said Mr. D. "Charles comes out for his midnight break to smoke a cigarette. Usually comes over to say hi to me."
"He's lighting something,"
reported Piff in a dreamy tone.
"Oh, it makes a very appealing little red glow."
"You were saying something,"
Kat barely remembered not to shout.
"about your grandmother? A story?" "Yeah, but I can't remember it all. That's how you can tell the doors is open, my grandmother used to say. The doors to the spirit world. But I'm trying to remember."
"He's coming over,"
Piff reported.
"He's away from the windows, but I can see that lovely little light moving toward us now."
He sank lower down the window, still staring out at the lot, tiny body swaying from side to side like a charmed snake.
"Hurry, Mr. D!"
Kat was almost dancing with impatience.
"The doors are open," she said. "How can you tell when the doors are open?" Something about a clock."
Mr. D was now frowning fiercely, thinking hard.
"The scissor hour? When the clock hands come together?" No. He shook his head. "Man, I can't believe I'm caught up in this craziness. No, she said, and he clapped his hands together so suddenly and loudly the cat jumped in fright, and Piff was buffeted against the window of the booth like a seagull in a squall. "I remember. She told me some story about a man who got carried away by some haunts. But when he was in the ghost lands, he heard a clock strike 13. She said that's how he knew the door was open and that spirits could cross back and forth." 13?
Ezra sounded disgusted. Clocks don't strike 13 here, only 12. That's the most. Yeah, said Mr. D, then looked down at his wrist. And you gonna hear it soon. Bong! Another single note from the crouching tower across the street, deep as the sea and just as unknowable, shuddered through Kat's body. She could still feel it for long seconds after the echo faded. Enough, finished Mr. D, looking at the little clock on his wrist in satisfaction. That means it's 15 minutes to go until midnight. He realized he had lost the thread and looked up. His little smile vanished as he saw Kat's panicked face. Oh, sorry about that, girl. But that's all I know. Clock strikes 13, my yaya said. Means the doors are open. But it's not almost 12, Kat said. It's almost 1 in the morning because I fell out of my world at 12 o'clock. It must be almost 1. Mr. D puzzled for a moment. Maybe you don't have that, what's it called, daylight savings time in your world. Daylight savings time? Kat had never heard of anything so weirdly magical. Yeah, daylight savings time. Look at my watch. He held up the clock on his wrist so she could see it. The hands were moving toward the top, toward the 12, just like when she had been snatched away from her home by the Scissor hour. The other guard's coming! Ezra was beginning to sound panicky, as if he was the one who might never get back to his own world.
Oh, yeah, that's right,
said Pift in a preoccupied voice from the window.
Suck hard. Make it bright.
Kat had made a decision. It terrified her, but she did not want to be dragged back into the hospital, into that eldritch world of cobwebby wires and beeping, blinking, remorseless things. Come on, Ezra, she said, and grabbed the handles of his wheelchairs. Pift, you too. We're going. Going where? Asked Mr. D. You can't just go running out. Ezra's real sick. Like I don't know that? Ezra's voice startled Kat with its anger. Like I don't know that? I told you I'm going to die in that bed. Let me have this one night, Mr. D. Don't tell Charles. Don't tell anyone, please. For a moment they stared at each other, the big man hunched over, the boy propped awkwardly on the cushioned wheelchair. But it was clear to Kat that there was far less resolve in the guard's expression than in Ezra's. Dang, said Mr. D at last. I know I'm going to hate myself for this, but get on. Scat. I didn't see nothing, and if you get caught, you better tell him that same story. I'm not losing my job over no craziness like this. I got a kid, and his mama's expecting that we can keep feeding him. Hurry, was all Ezra said. Kat leaned into the handles of the wheelchair, and they rolled forward away from the guard booth. Thank you, Ezra added, but he said it in a whisper, and Kat couldn't tell who he was saying it to. It was only a few dozen yards to the edge of the parking lot, but Kat pushed the chair in a wide, swinging loop to keep cars between them and anybody visiting Mr. D's booth. As they slid out between 2 rows and onto the sidewalk, bathed in a sickly orange light from a lantern on a tall pole, she stopped, looking back, and turned toward the street. The church loomed even larger above them now, a squatting beast just a few dozen paces away, tower stretching up like a long neck, as if at any moment it might bend and snatch them up. Just looking at it made Kat shiver so hard that she almost lost her grip on Ezra's chair, but she pulled it back before it rolled into the gutter. The street was empty of traffic, so she lowered her head and steered him out of the pool of orange light, heading toward the black facade and the even deeper darkness of the sunken front door. Is there a spell to get in? She asked. Ezra made an amused noise, but his throat sounded tight. Spell? No, we use keys and stuff. But I think it's open. They had reached the stairs. Why do you think that? I just do. The boy's voice took on a stubborn edge. Because I made a wish. And I think it's trying to come true. Kat had no idea what he meant, but she could almost feel time leaking away from her like a spent wave sliding back into the ocean. She somehow knew that whatever would happen had to happen now, that she had to make the crossing at midnight, or things would be worse than spoiled. Something would change, and she might not ever get back home. Heart rabbiting, she stood at the base of the church stairs and tried to think of a way she could get Ezra up them. She was just about to tell him she'd have to leave him behind when he puzzled out her hesitation and said, "Turn me around." "What?" "Turn me around. Pull the chair up the stairs backward. You can do it. You just have to pull and lift. And don't let go." She pulled him up each one of the stony steps, straining until she saw white spots dancing before her eyes. The wheels bumped upward as slowly as ice forming. When they reached the landing, Kat started to bend over to catch her breath, but stopped herself. Instead, she stumbled to the door, and to her amazement, it swung open at a push. Ezra had been right. "We have to get to the bell," she said, gasping. "The bell. It's up in the tower." As she pushed him inside, the wrongness of the place dropped over her like a net, like a sticky spider web, something meant to catch her and hold her down until some monstrous creature could make a meal out of her. The candles all around the wide entry seemed to flare and flicker like the eyes of forest beasts, and the hollow noise of her footfalls echoed as though she had entered some impossibly huge stone cavern. With every moment, the feeling of desperation grew more powerful, more frightening. The place hated her. Kat could feel it, could hear the voices from the shadows, hissing and whispering. "Demon, heretic, enemy." Kat would have thought the voices were out of her own head, except she didn't even know what a heretic was. No, the presences were all around her, ranged along the walls and clinging to the ceiling, things that feared and despised her. The light of the candles showed her paintings and statues that looked like people, but their eyes were cold and condemning, their teeth bared as if to snarl. "Demon, in our sanctuary, unclean, unclean." "There," said Ezra, breaking through the spell of horror for a moment. "The elevator, go!" Moving as if actual physical blows were raining down on her. Bowed beneath the weight of the building's swirling, poisonous hatred, Kat staggered forward, pushing Ezra's wheelchair toward the doorway he indicated with one shaking, half-lifted arm. They got into it just as she heard a new noise, footsteps coming out of the shadows, and saw a grotesque shape lurch toward them, all black but for a waxy pale face that seemed to be melting so that all she could see were bulging eyes and a wide, sagging mouth. The apparition had no legs that she could see, and despite the audible footsteps, she could have sworn that the thing was sliding across the floor like a slug. "Death, death, death, death," was what she heard it groaning. "All must die that do not worship, that do not believe." "It's the priest. We'll be in trouble if he catches us," Ezra whispered, which seemed such a monstrous understatement. Surely a horror like that would suck out her innards and pull apart her bones. That Kat could not believe he was seeing the same thing she saw. "Push the button," he told her, "the highest one." She did. A moment later, the door slid shut, hiding them from the shambling thing in tattered black.
"You almost left me out there,"
Pip squeaked from the ceiling of the elevator.
"This is becoming a problem, you know. Just because I'm small doesn't mean I can pass through walls and close doors."
She did not have the strength to answer him. As the elevator struggled upward, she could still feel the angry presence of dozens of disapproving spirits and hear the never-ending murmur of their loathing. It was all she could do not to drop to her knees and surrender. The elevator stopped. The door opened. The room before them was not a room at all, but a hallway stretching away before them with doors opening on both sides. "We're not there," said Ezra, and for the first time his desperation seemed to mirror Kat's.
I'll go look,
said Pift, and buzzed away down the corridor into darkness that the elevator car's single light could not dispel. A moment later he returned.
Last one on the end is a stairway,
he fluted. Kat could barely hear him through the monstrous noise in her head.
I looked through the keyhole, but I can hear the gears grinding. I think the bell is about to ring.
Even as he said it, Kat felt rather than heard something click. Then, bong! The deep sound crashed into her like a public carriage. She struggled to stay upright. "Hurry!" said Ezra. "Hurry!" She rolled him down the corridor to the end and yanked open the door. The stairs climbed steeply out of sight. "We'll never get your chair up that," she said. Bong! "I'll have to leave you." "No, carry me." "I can't." "Carry me." Bong! She stooped, certain that she was giving away her only chance, but something she could not define would not let her leave Ezra behind. It was hard to get him out of the chair, made even harder by Ezra clumsily grabbing at the metal footrest of his chair for reasons she could not understand. Her panic had now almost overwhelmed her. "Get on my back," she said. "Hold on." Bong! The sound of the bell seemed to roll down on her like a boulder. For a moment her knees buckled beneath Ezra's weight. He put his hand against the wall to stop them both from falling, letting out a wheezing cry of pain, but she was able to regain her balance and followed Pift up the stairs, feeling as if she carried the entire hideous stony weight of the church on her back. Bong! As the bell sounded again, shaking the walls and the steps beneath her feet, angry faces swirled past her, horrible, mocking masks of hatred and terror, as though she were the danger, as though she, Catkin Winterberry, who still slept with a nightlight and had failed her last cantrips test, was some terrible murderous beast of the outer dark. Bong! "I can't do it," she gasped. "I can't." "You can," Ezra said. "You can. You're a fairy. You're magic." "I'm not," she thought. "I'm not magic at all. I'm ordinary. What's all around me, that's magic. Evil, cruel magic. It hates me. It's beating me down with its hate. I can't." And then suddenly they reached the landing at the top of the stairs and the doorway of another room with a high vaulted ceiling. Hanging from it at head height in a tangle of ropes and gears was a squatly ominous bell. A gear clicked. Bong! The sound exploded through her thoughts. She staggered forward, but the last of her strength had drained away. Ezra tumbled off her back onto the cobbled stone floor with a cry of pain. Kat tried to rise, but her legs seemed leagues away, not even hers, things that someone else had used too much and then tossed aside. Bong! "Get up," said Ezra through clenched teeth as he struggled to turn over, stiff and helpless as a turtle. "It's my wish too, remember? It's my wish too." "What are you talking about?" But she tried to get her body under her to make one last attempt to drag him forward. Bong! Then, as if they had crossed some kind of threshold, a gray shape materialized out of the darkness of the bell loft, blocking her path. She lifted her head, expecting to see some ghastly, devouring thing, some vast evil that would envelop her and pull her into madness and blackness forever. But the face that she could dimly see, faint as someone peering through a steamy window, did not seem angry at all, but open and kind. Bong! The figure lifted a hand, beckoning. On its other shoulder sat a small but bright white gleam. At first, Kat thought it was Pift, crouching there, holding some precious morsel of radiance he had collected, but she could feel the night sprite in her hair, tugging until the pain shocked her into movement.
Hurry!
He squeaked into her ear. Bang! The loudest yet, shivering her thoughts to flying dust. That's 11! Ezra yelped. It just went for the 11th time! She barely heard him, because someone else was speaking. Come, the gray shape told her, and she heard the gentle, musical voice in her head, not with her ears. Pay no attention to the angry ones, those who curse and threaten. They know not what they do. All children are welcomed on the road and in the kingdom. All of good heart are welcome. And then the beckoning shape vanished, the light hovering at its shoulder flaring brightly for an instant before it too disappeared. Kat grabbed Ezra's arm, holding tight to his hospital shirt, and began to crawl toward the bell, but she was too late. Bong! The final toll of midnight sounded, dropping Kat's heart like a stone. She had failed. She would never get home. 13! Gasped Ezra, still sprawled flat on his back like a boggart run over in the street. Make it strike 13! And he lifted the metal footrest of his wheelchair, which he had clutched and held all the way up the stairs, his arm shaking so that he could barely raise it above the floor. One more, Kat! One more! For a moment she could only stare. 13? Then she understood and snatched the metal plate from his hand. She flung herself toward the bell even as the 12th strike shuddered into silence, the old day being cut away from the new one, the moment of the scissor hour, and she struck the bell as hard as she could with the footrest. Bang! This ring was higher in pitch, but still powerful enough that Kat thought the echo almost louder than the original. An instant later, she realized that the echo of the 13th toll was louder and that the echoes were growing in strength, a wobbling, drawn-out, metallic note that she could feel as well as hear. A sourceless light began to flicker and flare around the bell. Kat tried to drag herself toward it. Take me with you! She looked back at Ezra in surprise. You can't. My home, it's not your world. Do you think I care? What have I got here? I'd rather die somewhere new. She took his outstretched hand and tried to pull him along with her, but it was like dragging a bag of rocks. I can't do it. You can. Remember, you're my wish. It didn't make sense, but it did. Still, the echoes were beginning to fade, and now the light seemed to be guttering, too, the shadows of the bell loft eating away at it from all sides. Kat knew she had only an instant to make her way back, if this flickering blob of light even led back. I could wind up anywhere, she thought. But just as she was poised on the edge of either letting go of Ezra or giving up, something flew past her face. Pift grabbed at the collar of Ezra's nightshirt and began to pull in the direction of the light, his wings beating so fast they were almost invisible. It made no difference. The night sprite might have been trying to drag an unconscious ogre, but watching the little creature on the verge of losing its own chance by helping her and the sick boy, Kat found a strength she did not know she possessed. But you don't know what will happen, she cried, every muscle burning as she dragged Ezra the last foot across the stone floor. It's not like here. Good! Terror and elation fought in Ezra's voice. And then, as the cool, murmuring light enveloped them all, she heard him again, his words fading. I should have left a note for Mary Alba. Tick! The longer hand of the clock slipped a single click to the right. 1 minute after 12. 1 minute after 12? Kat lifted herself onto her elbows, bleary, her head aching. She was lying on the floor of her own room, in front of the antique clock, her chair lying half on top of her. 1 minute after 12. I fell down and hit my head. She pushed the chair off and sat up, head still spinning. It was all a dream. Something very small was bumping against her window as if trying to get out. That night sprite, I was trying to catch it, but I fell off the chair instead. Then the winged spot came buzzing toward her. It flew at her so quickly, straight at her face, that she lifted a hand to swat it away, then remembered her dream and held back. It hovered before her, gesticulating wildly, and she squinted until she could focus on its tiny expression. Angry, that was how it looked, or at least upset. "Go away," she said. "My head hurts." But the night sprite would not, and now began to speed back and forth between her and the window. She did her best to ignore it as she dragged the chair back to her desk and sat, cradling her face in her hands. "Leave me alone!" In her dream, the night sprite had possessed a name and could talk, but now all was as it had been. Its sounds were only irritating noise. The sprite flew to the far side of her desk and tried to lift a sheet of stationery, the cute ones with little cartoon mortal babies along the top that her mother had given her for trooping day. But the creature was too small to carry it and only managed to slide it off the top of the pile. As Kat stared at this strange behavior, the night sprite flew to the cup where she kept her pencils and began shoving the nearest with its feet, until Kat reached forward with hesitant fingers and withdrew the little rod of silverwood. The night sprite then sprang back into the air, its buzzing changing pitch to something like a miniature fanfare of triumph, and she suddenly remembered the part of her dream where the night sprite had asked her about writing. "You can't talk," she said, "and you can't write either. That was a dream." The tiny creature pushed at her hand, a gentle but persistent pressure she could feel. She could feel the almost imperceptible wind of its wings on her knuckle. It took Kat a moment to catch on, then she lowered the pencil to the paper and let the tiny winged thing guide her hand. A vertical line, another vertical line a short distance away and parallel, then a line across the top of them, making 3/4 of a box. Then an open bottom triangle placed atop the table-like figure. She stared down until she understood that she was looking at a crude drawing of a house. The night sprite balanced on her finger, staring at her. It wasn't all a dream? But it wasn't real. The night sprite made a sputtering, derisive noise at her, a miniature raspberry, like a housefly breaking wind. "But I still don't understand," Kat said. "Is that supposed to be my house?" The tiny creature bounced up and down on her hand until she moved the pencil over the paper again. This time the night sprite guided her in drawing an inexplicable shape beside the house, something that looked more like a lump of dung than anything else. Finished, the night sprite revved its wings and looked up expectantly, then flashed to the window again. As if she were still dreaming, Kat got up and followed it to her window. She could hear the sound of the mirror screen through the floor, laughter and music, the same program her parents had been watching before she hit her head. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the darkness outside, but then she saw it, a dark, uneven shape on the lawn, like the mound of a freshly dug grave. "By the king and queen," she said, shocked into swearing. "It was real? Oh no, poor Ezra!" It was all she could do to tiptoe past Great Gran's room and down the stairs past the sitting room when she wanted to run. She opened the front door as quietly as she could and then sprinted out into the front garden. "Oh, Ezra," she said as she fell down beside the irregular shape. "Oh, I'm so sorry." It was not a pile of freshly dug dirt that lay on the lawn, but something more solid, an irregular lump the size and length of a coffin that lay stretched on the grass, as if it had fallen out of the sky. She dropped onto her knees beside it and touched its surface, hard as stone. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said. She knew it had to be Ezra, knew it beyond doubt. It hadn't been a dream. He had come through with her, but once here in her world, he had turned to stone, for real. "I shouldn't have listened." As a tear, then several more, ran down her cheeks and off her chin, the night sprite arrowed past her and flew down the length of the rocky mass before returning to hover in front of her. "Pift," she said. "And is that really your name? I'm sorry. I thought I hit my head and imagined it. I'm sorry about everything." She couldn't see his tiny face, but could sense something of his disquiet, feel him fluttering near her face. "What?" Then she heard what the tiny sprite must have heard first, a quiet, scraping sound. Slowly, she lowered her fingers to the stony mass before her. Then she could feel it too, a ticking like the noise of her antique clock, but more irregular. Something was trying to get out. "Ezra?" she said. A piece of the hardened lump popped off the surface and fell back. A pair of damp fingers poked out of the hole. "Ezra? Is that you?" Cat began widening the gap in the stony mantle. Only a few paces away beyond the glowing window, her parents were still watching the mirror screen as Cat broke pieces from the hole, pieces that felt more like thickened eggshell than stone. At last she saw Ezra's face, damp and reddened by exertion, peering out of the growing opening. "Ezra, you're alive! You're real!" "I need to get out," he grunted, and began breaking away the uneven shell with his own hands, faster and faster until it came away in great chunks. At last, most of the top was gone, and he lay exposed in the stone shroud. No, the cocoon, Cat decided, giddy and overwhelmed, because that was what it now looked like. "Help me up," he said. She took his hand, and to her astonishment, he climbed out and stood on his own 2 feet, still swathed in goo and fragments of the thing that had held him. Then, as if to prove that astonishment had no upper limit, 2 great shapes unfurled, damp and trembling, and spread themselves behind him. Even in the midnight darkness, she could see that they were riotous with color. "You have wings," she said quietly, because she had the breath for nothing else. Ezra craned his neck, trying to see them. All traces of his debilitating condition seemed gone. "I do," he said, and laughed an almost hysterical laugh. "And I'm standing up. I can stand by myself. And I have wings." He turned to her, his round cheeks stretched in a gigantic grin, even as tears rolled down his face. "Is this fairyland?" Pift flitted rapidly around Ezra's head, squeaking in pleasure, ignoring even the seductive glow of the nearby street lantern in the triumph of the moment. "It is," Cat said. Something surged inside her, and she began to cry again, but these were not mournful tears. "This is fairy. My home." "Your home now, too, I guess." Cat was dazed. So many things would change now. She would have to explain to her parents that she had a new brother. A brother with wings much larger than great-grand's, and that they had a new son. And she was still going to have to teach a night sprite how to read and write, because a promise was a promise. The boy from another world flapped his new wings, shouting with pure pleasure. The night sprite wove in and out around them as they beat, buzzing excitedly. Lights were coming on now in some of the neighboring houses. At least things aren't going to be boring anymore, Catkin Winterberry said aloud, to no one in particular. And that's the end of the story. So, since I ran a bit late, I'm not going to spend a long time wrapping up. Tomorrow or tonight, 7 p.m., I will start reading something new. I haven't decided what yet because I need to find out which things are sold and which things I can read because they're not sold or they were sold a long time ago or, whatever, stuff like that. But anyway, thank you. Sorry I ran a little bit late, but I appreciate those of you who stuck with me. And again, anybody who misses these things can find them on YouTube or on, thanks to Chris, or to tadwilliams.com, and thanks to Ilva, and, on my social media sites. So all of you, please take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, take care of your friends and neighbors. Meanwhile, I am going to go. So thank you so much for joining me. I will see you at 7 p.m., those of you who can be here, at 7 p.m., just a scant 16 or so hours from now. The rest of you, I will see you, if you want, next week for this same time slot, for this same shift. And can I just say one last time, thank you, and it's a huge pleasure to be able to do this with all of you. Have a lovely morning, daytime, afternoon, evening, night, whatever it may be, wherever you is. I hope it's a good one, and I will see you very soon.